I'm Fredrik Curtin, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And this is Pushback Talks, this summer series 2022. So Leilani, first of all, wind back a few weeks. There was a showing of Push, the film, in the European Parliament. And you were presenting the work you've been on for a long time now, more than a year, working. The shift human rights directives.
Yes.
How was it? Tell me.
It was fantastic. You know, it's hard to host a screening of a film and launch what is, in fact, looks like a report, you know, in Parliament. We know this because we've tried this before, and there was tons of interest. We did a panel afterward to talk about the shift directives and the film and what's happening in Europe. It was great. It was live streamed. I think there were maybe over 50 people in the room and more than 50 people online. So it was good.
And I know the film was going out with subtitles in many versions. We were asked to deliver many subtitle versions,
Exactly.
Which we have, of course, of the film.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, it's amazing. The film came out, of course, in 2019. But the relevance, it's more relevant now in some ways. People are catching up to the film, which is interesting, right? And the directives, there was a feeling, I was so pleased. There was a feeling that people were waiting for this. Solutions. What can governments do to stop this in its tracks, this financialization of housing? So, and really embracing the human rights framework. It's super cool. We're in it's a different landscape.
I think what you are doing and your peeps are doing, Leilani, is really cool. And I think because you're delivering language and tools to, also for politicians, ambitious politicians and activists and others, to be able to say, okay, hey, what do you say about this? Shouldn't we agree on having this as a platform? And it will be easier for people to move it. And then also, because the industry will always come with their propaganda language that will always sound really nice, but then you can check their language with your directives, and then they will say, oh, doesn't fit.
Yeah, exactly. I've already been approached by some people who are working with investors of different types in the housing area market and trying to figure out how they can use the directives in their relations with investors. So this is very cool. And I always anticipated the directives would be like a provocation to provoke a conversation, to provoke a different way of thinking, to, you know, and I think that's the effect they're having already. And this is very early days. I haven't even really rolled them out in any significant way yet.
And our dear listeners of Pushback Talks, this autumn, coming up, fall coming up. Well, don't think about now. We're going to enjoy the summer. But anyway, there will be a time when the summer is not more. And then we will dive deeper into these directives to really understand what Leilani and her team has been shaping. And so we'll be looking forward to that. But now, as this is a summer series, we try to bring out interesting stuff from what we've done during the year. And we're actually going to start with China, because we did an episode called Can the Communist Party in China Save Capitalism? I like the title because China is, you know, it's this communist party, but it's also a very brutal, raw capitalistic society. I mean, it's even rawer and more brutal than, let's say, the Nordic social democratic societies or France or Germany or others. It's workers are much more under pressure in China than in many other countries.
Yeah, aggressive kind of, very unique, aggressive kind of capitalism, isn't it?
Yeah, but we looked into a very special company, Leilani.
Evergrande.
Yeah, what is Evergrande?
Evergrande was, what's the status of Evergrande? A huge company with huge real estate holdings, particularly residential real estate holdings, that found themselves in a huge amount of debt, mega debt. And they weren't going to be able to pay off this debt, they were looking at bankruptcy, putting a lot of people in very terrible circumstances, people who had purchased units that hadn't even been built yet. And so sitting there empty-handed, both no money and no home. A lot of people in China use real estate as a way to secure their money. And Evergrande is part of that.
So we hooked up with a very knowledgeable man, Dexter Roberts, who was the former bureau chief of an Asia news editor for Bloomberg. And he's just also released a book about the Chinese capitalism. So, of course, we asked him about the relation, the role of real estate in the Chinese economy today.
Well, one of the first things that you need to understand about the Chinese economy is the degree to which it is reliant on real estate to drive economic growth. Most estimates put about a third of the economy in some way being related to the property sector. And the other thing to know about China's economy and also the property sector is it's very, very indebted. They've built up huge amounts of debt from years, more than a decade of high levels of investment, and they're starting to get very worried about this. So, the property sector is the most indebted part of the economy, and the government has decided that that's not good for long-term growth.
Can I just stop you there, because I'm already a bit mind-blown. Did you notice, Leilani, that 1/3 of the Chinese economy is real estate?
I did. I wrote it down.
We know China from producing tons of stuff that we consume. But this is real estate is, of course, for internal use in some way. So, Dexter, and what does it mean that this big part of the Chinese economy is real estate?
Well, from China's perspective, it means that there's a great degree of instability in the economy. They also, not only do they rely a lot on real estate, but real estate is they build more real estate than they actually need. So we have an issue with upwards of 20% of apartments, for example, being vacant in China. Most people do have their own homes, but there's also a lot more that actually aren't even filled yet. And this is a problem.
So the Chinese housing crisis is a backward one. We were reading some numbers, I don't know how to check them, but that between 60 and 90 million empty apartments in China, it sounds insane.
Yeah, it's a very, very large number. The other thing to keep in mind is that because your average Chinese person doesn't have a lot of investment opportunities, the capital accounts in the economy are closed. There's not a lot of investment elsewhere. I think it's 90% of household wealth is put into housing. So a lot of people have more than one apartment, and this has been fine because real estate values have gone up for years and years. As long as they keep going up, everybody's happy. The Chinese government's happy because the economy keeps growing, and the Chinese people are happy because their savings keep going up. And the fear is that will change.
We Leilani, have been talking about capitalism on steroids when we talk about the housing sector and the real estate sector in the Western economies, but this sounds like it's on some extra strong steroids, the Chinese economy, Leilani.
It does sound like it's on steroids, as does, it makes me think about the inequality that must exist in China, because I know that huge portions of the population are living in deplorable housing conditions in what I think are called villages, like urban villages. And obviously those households can't afford to invest in real estate or can't afford to purchase fancy homes in these skyscrapers. So if you've got 60 to 90 million vacant homes, that suggests that there's some segment of the population that can invest, and or that there's overproduction at the wrong level. In other words, things are being produced that actually don't meet the need of people at the lower end of the economic spectrum.
That's absolutely true. The average housing price as a multiple of annual household income in Beijing and Shanghai is about 25. So 25 times what they would earn in a year to buy for an apartment. And that compares to, I think it's something like 8 times in London and maybe 7 times in New York, which are cities that obviously aren't known for cheap prices. So we're talking about extremely expensive apartments in the cities. As you say, a very large portion of the population is in substandard housing. We have the world's largest internal migrant population of almost 300 million people. And they, for a variety of historical reasons and reasons today, are really treated as second-class citizens. And as you point out, yes, there's a lot of housing out there, and it's not accessible to them in almost all cases.
But then the crisis right now is not about these 300 million migrant workers in China. It's about the middle class who are sitting with their investments and about to lose them. And then also in the bigger part of the business community and the government, I guess, if Evergrande can't pay their bills, it must be.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. So, I mean, Evergrande, I think by most estimates, is China's second largest real estate company. As you said, they have hundreds of projects around the country that are half built. The way it works in China is they take the payment up front. So believe it or not, you'll buy an apartment that's not going to actually be built for the next 3 years. So you have, huge numbers of Chinese people that have paid for apartments that don't have them yet, that are now afraid that if Evergrande goes bust, they'll never get them. Evergrande owes $300 billion. A much smaller portion of that, about 20 billion, is to overseas creditors. So the real challenge, the people that are really stand to lose are the Chinese people if Evergrande does go bust.
$300 billion. I stopped have any feeling of how much money that is, but I guess it's a lot.
It's a lot.
Very much so.
And I think of that, something like 40 billion is foreign investment. I don't know who exactly. I had heard that BlackRock, for example, one of our friends on this show, so-called friends on our show, big private equity firm, was one of the foreign investors, but there must be many more. At $40 billion is a lot of money.
Yeah, I think it is. It's maybe 20 billion, but it's a lot of money. And I think BlackRock is one, and some of the other sort of the usual suspects. I think a lot of the big finance houses, global finance houses that are involved in property are invested in China. So, I mean, that's why we saw a global sell-off on markets, in part because of that exposure by big multinationals, but even more so, I would say, the sell-off was because of the very real fear that if Evergrande went bust and the larger real estate sector, and it's not just Evergrande, started seeing more and more bankruptcies, that would hit the Chinese economy. Once the Chinese economy has a major downturn, that has a real global impact beyond just these international, financial companies.
So should we be worried, or how do you see it?
So, I mean, actually, the latest news, I think on Friday evening, Evergrande announced through a filing to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange where they're listed that they were in fear, that they were basically afraid they were going to default. What happened very quickly was the Guangdong government, which is the provincial government where Evergrande is based down in the south of the country near Hong Kong, immediately issued a statement saying, we are in consultation with Evergrande and we're going to try to work with them on risk and make sure operations continue as normal. So this just is a reminder of the degree to which the Chinese government, both the provincial government and the central government in Beijing, is worried about the fate of Evergrande and the fate of the larger real estate sector. So I think the short answer is we don't need to worry yet. China has so much riding on the continued growth of the real estate sector that they're not going to let such a high-profile company implode in a way that would hurt the Chinese economy very, very badly.
I'm interested in the government's response to this Evergrande situation because, I don't know that much about China. I read the news like anyone else, and I keep seeing references to the president's commitment to a common prosperity, and even a slogan that houses are for living in, not for speculation. So I'm wondering, I think those are interesting concepts there, the idea of common prosperity and the idea that houses aren't for speculation. I mean, those are things that actually resonate with me as a human rights lawyer and advocate. Has this translated into anything from the government side in terms of how they're dealing with Evergrande?
Well, I would say that, I mean, there's really two major reasons why they're trying to solve the issues of Evergrande. And one is the one I already mentioned, which is the excessive debt levels, which potentially is destabilizing for the whole economy, particularly if these big companies like Evergrande start going bankrupt. But the other one is the one you just pointed to, which is what Xi Jinping does indeed call common prosperity. And this, which in its simplest form is an effort to try to make the economy fairer and deal with some of these extremes of inequality that are now very, very much alive and becoming more severe in the Chinese economy. Housing is one of what the Chinese government likes to refer to as the three big mountains. And these three big mountains is housing, education costs, and also healthcare costs. And they are seen, and indeed the government is right, as contributing to these issues, the problem with inequality. So I think, yes, I mean, I think there is an equally important motivation by Beijing, which is to try to bring down housing prices, and along with this very real debt issue.
Because I'm starting to think about the parallels to, I mean, the great financial crisis here in 2008, I mean, where you're sitting with a lot of normal people investing, buying 1 or 2 or 3 apartments, putting their savings there, and then of course you have this big scale, big operators that are the ones who can make a deal with the government when there is a crisis, which, I mean, the American government and many governments around the world helped their big banks and financial institutions to get out of it in some ways, but they didn't really help the small people when the ordinary people so in the U.S. like 30 million people lost their homes. Do you think this is something that can happen in China also? Because if the value drops of the housing market, it will mean a lot for those ordinary people who had invested.
I think there's the Chinese government is facing this great conundrum because really since the global financial crisis in 2009, they have moved to this economic model, which is primarily driven by greater and greater investment, some 45% of GDP. And a very large portion of that, maybe a third of that, is real estate investment. So the economy rises and falls with the real estate market, and they know that. So they do want to bring down prices. They realize that this growing inequality, wealth inequality, is potentially socially destabilizing. People are very upset about it. But they also are in this very difficult situation. If they crack down too hard on real estate and try to bring down prices too much, it's going to hurt the overall economy. That will hurt the standing of the leadership, the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, that will hurt the people as well. So they want to bring down prices. They want to deleverage and bring down debt. But on the other hand, if they do it too quickly, they're going to actually hurt the economy and hurt the people as well.
Which is the same. I mean, in my own country, Sweden, we have the highest debt per person in housing costs, for example. So I mean, everybody knows that this is not a sound situation, and that at some moment, if the prices go down, a lot of normal people will lose a lot. So there is a lot of stress connected to this, and of course, that's so the governments it's hard for them to move.
Yes, and one other thing I would just add is one of the glaring policy steps that they should have taken years ago, and they've been talking about over a decade, is to institute a property tax. And they talk about, housing is for living in, not for speculation. Well, one way to fix that in the real situation in China is to put a property tax on, so people decide this isn't such a great speculative investment. But they don't want to do that. I mean, they want to do that, but there's been great resistance, and part of it is probably average people who aren't used to paying a property tax. But even more so, I would say it's elite Chinese, many of them government officials themselves, who own, in some cases. It's not uncommon for a government official to have 15 different apartments in cities around the country. And not only do they not want to pay tax on that, they also don't want that fact exposed publicly, that they have so much wealth in housing. So the government's been talking about it forever. Xi Jinping, the general secretary of the Communist Party, just again mentioned that China should move forward on a property tax. But until today, it's really just 2 pilot programs in the cities of Shanghai and a big western city of Chongqing. And there's been signs recently that they're sort of backpedaling on that plan to institute a property tax.
Yeah, I read that they were contemplating this property tax, and I was surprised. What? So much property there and no property taxes? It's pretty wild. But one of the things I don't understand, Dexter, or maybe you can help elucidate, isn't it the case that the government themselves contributed to Evergrande's woes? I mean, didn't they make... So, I come at this as a human rights lawyer, you got to remember that. But I recall reading that money became more expensive and is more expensive now in China than it was. In other words, it was more expensive to borrow. And that the government was looking at regulations and maybe has passed them, I don't know, to make it more difficult to borrow. In other words, if you haven't paid off your debt, you're not going to be able to borrow, for example, is one of the regs that I had heard was being discussed. So is it the case that they kind of brought Evergrande to their knees and now are in the position of trying to figure out, okay, we brought them to their knees, but we also believe in common prosperity and we need to save people from economic ruin? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, no, you are. The situation they're facing today with Evergrande almost bankrupt and many other property developers very much is of their own making. I think it was last summer, a year ago this summer, they instituted tight new restrictions on credit. And as you say, they made it much more difficult to borrow if you already had high debt levels. And this isn't, they in their policies, they often like to number things. This is actually another trio. They call it the 3 red lines. And the 3 red lines was a policy instituted to try to deal with the overheated property sector. And it was very much a government policy, and it very much brought China's real estate sector to where it is today. And yes, now this year property prices are going to still grow, I think just barely, maybe by a couple percentage points after probably twice that at least the previous year in 2020. Next year, the first half, most people that watch the property market are expecting them to fall. And so on the one hand, this meets the goal of the Chinese government to try to bring down some of the frothiness and reduce the costs that your average Chinese has to pay to buy a place. But on the other hand, again, it has real economic implications. So they're really between the proverbial rock and the hard place. They want to cool this down. They know long term that the leverage in the economy is not sustainable, and the real estate market, again, is the most leveraged part of all industries in China. But on the other hand, they don't want to see the economy really slow. And they particularly, by the way, don't want to see it slow in the run-up to one of their very most important political meetings, which is the every 5-year party congress of the Communist Party, which happens next fall. That one's particularly important because Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he's going to break with precedent and stay on as leader of China for more than the typical 10 years. So they do not want the economy to tank before next October.
Okay, let's see what happens.
Not.
I mean, China has always been a mystery. Maybe not as much for you as for us, but because you've been there for so many years. But I mean, it's an extreme radical capitalism in some way, or in many ways. And then you have the Communist Party and the state. So, I mean, we also in the West have a big problem with an extreme capitalism that is creating this big divides in our societies. It's, I mean, the same thing that they are in some ways are also up against right now. But do you think that this fact that there is a very strong state that can just do what they want, can they solve things better in China? Can they get out of this?
They can make big dramatic moves, and they can order, you know, the banking system is almost 100% state owned. They can tell banks, you know, we don't want these property companies to default. Actually, we decided that the deleveraging push has gone too far. Loosen up the spigots and lend them more money. So they have these abilities that we certainly don't have in many other countries around the world. But I think long term it doesn't solve this problem again of this conundrum of the economy becoming so reliant on investment, which has to do with the fact that it's so state run and you know trying to create a more sustainable. They want a more household consumption driven economy. So most of the economy is again driven by investment, as I said, a lot of that through lending by state banks. And on the other hand, the households don't typically have enough money, in part because of the vast inequalities, wealth and income inequalities. So you've got a large proportion of the people, as the Premier Li Keqiang said last year, famously or infamously, they have 600 million people that live on 1,000 renminbi a month, which is about less than $160 a month. So they have a very large number of poor people as well. So that's so I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think that they can take moves. They can make dramatic moves, for example, to save a company like Evergrande. But can they actually deal with these longer term issues and imbalances in the economy? That's not so clear.
Yeah.
Dexter, I've seen some documentaries and images of these kind of new built ghost cities around China, and I guess that Evergrande is a part of that, building those cities. Have Absolutely. You been to any of these places?
I have, yeah. I've been to a number of them.
How is it?
So it's very strange. So the one I went up to in Inner Mongolia, which is north of Beijing, which is one of the more famous ones, the only people they could convince to live there were local government officials. So they thought so, but a lot of the local government officials refused to move there. So a very interesting experience you would see. They moved the city government there. They moved all the functions of the city government. And at the end of the day, and I was there at the end of the day, these big buses pull up outside the local courthouse and in the local government offices, and all the local officials get in them and get on their buses to go back to the city where they actually live, which is the old city, which is it's quite a sight. And all the buses drive out, and then the city is really a ghost town for the night. The interesting thing is, so as I said, I mean, some government officials, some wealthy people will have maybe a dozen apartments around the country. They want a couple in Beijing, a couple in Shanghai, one back in their hometown in the province. So you have a situation where there's a lot of vacant apartments, obviously, as we were discussing. That doesn't necessarily matter if the people, if housing prices keep going up. They're seen as a repository of wealth for whomever owns them. And as long as the local governments continue to, in some cases, seize land from local farmers and redevelop it and make money, and by the way, as I said a moment ago, help pay the local, that money that they get from housing development also goes towards important things like paying local pensions, building schools, and so on. As long as that continues in this merry-go-round, everything's fine. And so what the Chinese, I mean, it gets back to what the Chinese government is trying to do right now, which is deflate that leverage bubble and try to create an economy that long-term is more sustainable, more reliant on spending power of the people and less on investment, less on real estate. That's where it becomes a problem, because they want to deflate the property values to a degree, become more affordable. They want to wean the economy and off to a degree off its reliance on ever more building. But at the same time, they can't go too far, or they'll actually derail the economy, and people will see the values that they put into these apartments lost overnight.
In my film Push, where Leilani is featured, we meet with a leading sociologist, Saskia Sassen, in London, and she talks about, I mean, why are there's all these empty buildings, also in New York, empty apartments, and she explains that there are assets in a financial game, so it doesn't really matter if somebody lives there or not. But of course, how long can this run? With a lot of empty assets. I mean, at some point, if you see a big city out in the Chinese desert and nobody lives there, is that asset still worth something?
I mean,
it's a bit strange.
I think it makes my head go a bit fuzzy. I can't, one can imagine the value of an empty condo building in the heart of Manhattan. But I mean, I've been to similar ghost areas in Egypt, for example, where they are just simply depositories for cash, investment, it's personal pension fund, that kind of thing. And it's in the middle of the desert, nothing there, no vibrancy, no city, nothing to give it value beyond the land that it's on which it sits. It's just, it's a bit mind-boggling. To me, it's like such a stark representation of the capitalism that we're living with right now. And that, as Fredrik said, that governments have allowed this to happen.
I agree. Yeah, it is astonishing. And the place I just mentioned in Inner Mongolia is really in the middle of nowhere, out on this. It's not desert, it's steppe, but there's nothing there. There's no reason to have a city there. And they have a perfectly fine city already, which is where people still want to live.
Do you think people ever will come and live there?
Well, the hope is that they'll fill them up. And I mean, the example that people bring up is, way back decades ago, they started to build a vast new city across the river in Shanghai called Pudong. And people said, this is a white elephant, they're crazy. And now it's a vibrant, new, very important part of one of the most important, vibrant cities in China. But that was right next door to Shanghai with centuries of history as a vibrant city and economically growing. And this is something different, I think, now. The other thing that is a real worry for China is, if you look at getting into the economics of it, if you look at the productivity of the economy, it's come down dramatically. So basically that means that for every dollar that they put in, whether it's lent by a state bank and often put into building a new apartment block, which might be empty, they're getting, to use the cliche, less bang for their buck. So the GDP effect or the amount of GDP they get out of the investment keeps going down. And they know that. So 10 years ago, they could loan a certain amount of money and the economy would grow by a certain amount. Now, that's not the case anymore. They need to loan, several times as much money just to get the economy to basically remain stable and not slow. And that's because of this declining return on investments. That's because ultimately they've built too many things that aren't really economically productive. And so this is a real concern of the government. And they're aware of this in China, but they haven't figured out a solution to it.
So extreme capitalism killed communism. Or whatever it is. I'm not too happy with labels, but I mean it's a bit weird. So to sum up this, I mean, it's been amazing to have you here with all your knowledge, and I hope a lot of people will read your book, The Myth of the Chinese Capitalism, because I think you're touching upon a lot of these things here. So where shall we see China go now the coming years?
I think there were hopeful signs in this push for common prosperity, and this very openly stated awareness by the leadership that the growing inequality is a problem. But if we look at sort of the policies that they've taken, I mean, bringing down the real estate sector is important and needed. It's just very difficult. So that's a good thing. But as I said earlier, despite its communist roots, they are very cautious about actually doing and taking policies that would clearly redistribute wealth. Xi Jinping, in a recent speech, warned of the dangers of what he called welfareism. So he's talking about common prosperity. He's also saying welfareism, just the worst. I mean, the absolute stereotype of a capitalist saying, the dangers of welfareism and providing so much support that people don't want to work. And he actually said this in a speech.
Wow.
So I think there's a real there's a gap between some of the rhetoric we hear from them and their actual policies. And then one other thing I just say quickly, which we haven't talked about, but which is a huge issue, is the aging population. The fact that they, if the workforce is shrinking, there's huge new costs for families and local governments to pay for elderly people, and this is going to be a big economic drag as well. And this is something that is really most demographers think it's going to be impossible for China to reverse this trend, which is a rapidly aging population at a point when China's not a very wealthy country, what other people have referred to as getting old before it gets rich. And this is something that's going to be a big drag on the economy. And frankly, it makes things like dealing with the real estate sector even more complicated going forward.
It's so interesting because, when the debate and the view on China, in the political debate in Sweden or the US or wherever, it's like the Chinese are coming is basically what the signal is in the media. But you're actually describing a weaker
Struggle.
China that are stuck with its own huge problems.
Absolutely. I've been a skeptic on this thing that global investment banks have repeated like a mantra about how China is poised within a decade to overtake the US as the world's largest GDP. There's plenty of reasons to think that might actually never happen because of these issues, these core challenges they face. Even if China does exceed the US, it's also possible that that it might fall back in terms of GDP. And finally, the third point, so what if the GDP exceeds the U.S.? They have these huge problems with inequality, with people. They announced that they solved the problem of extreme poverty, which perhaps they have. They've done a very good job in dealing with some of the extreme poverty issues, but there's still huge numbers, 600 million people at least, according to the premier, that are living in near poverty. And so these are all things that could indeed, I think, make China. I think you're right. I think there are fears in this sense that China's poised to take over the world, and I don't think that's what's coming at all.
Well, thank you, Dexter. Interesting thought that you think that the Chinese are not going to take over the world because that's like this alarm is going on all the time. It's good with perspective and knowledge. What do you say, Leilani?
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I like a different perspective.
Yeah. And well, this was Pushback Talks, and we will be back soon again every second week so that we will release a new episode, also from our summer series. But first of all, I have to share some news with you, Leilani.
Oh, please do.
We have listeners in many countries. This is one of the cool things with this podcast because it's a global issue and we have listeners all over the world. But now we have 141 countries.
Wow.
141.
Moving up in the world.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, we still have some way to go before we can kick UN in the butt, but still we will we'll try to. Some of the newcomers on the podcast, listeners like downloads, so it's Gibraltar, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Seychelles, Bhutan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Bahamas, Botswana. I could say more, but it's
incredible.
It's kind of cool.
It's very cool.
So you listeners out there, you're all welcome. And if you have somebody in the country that you don't think listen to this, tell them about the podcast. As you know, there is no commercials going out here, and we don't have any promotional power. And how big is our budget, Leilani, for this podcast?
$0. Well,
oh yeah. Oh shit. Yeah.
We're doing it for free. Remember?
We are doing it, and we have a lot of people working with it, and nobody really gets paid for this work.
That's right.
It's a bit crazy. And what are our pledge to our friends?
That we keep going.
Well, I think maybe our friends should pledge to us.
Oh yes.
Because we have.
Now you're talking.
We have something called.
Oh, the Patreon account.
Yeah.
We do. How many Patreons do we have now? Over 40?
Yeah, around 50.
Fantastic. We need more.
And that's people who are sending some little money every month to us. And for all of you who are in there, we are so grateful, but we need more. So if you have more friends, tell them to come in and support the podcast. Leilani, this was the story about the Chinese capitalism that the Communist Party is going to save. Next week, we're going to dive into a new story. So, hasta la vista, hasta luego, see you soon.
See you next week.
Ciao.